Hey everyone, my name's Tim, and today we're going to talk about teaching games. Now, if you've been involved in this hobby of ours at all, you'll know how important it is to attract new players to the table. And one of the things that's going to influence how excited people are and how enthusiastic they are about the hobby is the experience they have in learning a new game. So for all of us, the better we can be at teaching a new game, the better we're going to make that experience for people and the more people we're going to attract to the hobby. So today, we're going to talk about how we do a good job of teaching games. Okay, so let's begin at the beginning and let's talk about the overall steps or process that we're going to use to teach someone a new game. I'm going to introduce a 5-step process for teaching games. This isn't the only process you can use, but I found this 5-step process has really been helpful in keeping me on track and knowing where I need to go logically when I'm teaching a new game. So the first step I always like beginning with is, what is the objective of the game? If it's a victory point game, then how am I going about getting victory points? If it's an economic game, then how am I going to go about getting and earning more money in the game? So I always like starting with the end in mind, if you want to think of it that way, and making sure people understand what is the final outcome that they're working towards. Step two, we talk about the components in a game. And I love this part of teaching games because usually it's so visual and tactile for people and you can easily draw them in to the different components of the game. I like explaining at a fairly high level what each element or component does in the game, and that includes different regions or parts of a game board or different regions or parts of a playing card, and that would also include any iconography or icons that are common throughout the game. Step 3 is a fairly short step. I like to talk about what is the structure or the flow of the game. Is the game broken down into turns? Is there phases within those turns? Are there actions or steps within those turns? And how do we determine turn order? That's usually pretty quick, but it's important to anchor people on what is the overall structure or flow of the game. Step 4 is, what are the decisions or actions that people need to make in the game? Typically that occurs on their turn or in a phase of the game when an action is required by a player. And at that point, we want to make sure people understand what are the choices that they have to make during the game. And then finally, step 5, I like to touch on strategy and some of the finer points in the game. Now, I usually, if it's a brand new game for someone, I usually don't go into too much detail on what the strategy of the game is, but I just like touching on what are a couple tips for people from a strategy perspective, and then what are some of the other finer points. Once people understand the game broadly, what are some of the finer points in the game? So that's our 5-step process. Let's have a look at how this works by showing some examples of how we might approach each of these 5 steps with some games. Okay, so let's look at how we apply these 5 steps. So let's imagine that we've got a table full of brand new gamers who have never played a game before. How are we going to go about applying the 5 steps? Well, I'm going to use an example here of one of my favorite recent games, and that is the game London by Martin Wallace. And I'm just going to role play how I might take the people around the table through the 5 steps. Now, important thing to recognize already is that I've got my pieces organized and set up. You don't want to be fiddling with unpacking pieces and opening up boards when you begin your teaching. You want to have that all set up so that people can pay full attention to you and be fully absorbed by the explanation. So let's talk about part 1. And you remember, part 1 is the objective. What is the objective or the goal of this game? So I might say something like, welcome everyone to the game called London by Martin Wallace. Your objective in this game is to score the most victory points by the end of the game. And you're going to do that in one of 3 ways. The first way you're going to do that is by building parts of the city of London. They're called boroughs on the board, and those boroughs are going to score victory points, which are printed on the game board. Secondly, you're going to score victory points by collecting the cards in the game, and the cards have victory points printed on them. And thirdly, you're going to convert money at the end of the game at a ratio of 3-to-1 to victory points. Person with the most victory points is going to win. A couple things to keep in mind is that there are loans in the game, and if you collect too many of those, you're going to have to pay those back, or they're going to impact your victory points negatively. And likewise, if you have poverty at the end, poverty points are going to work against your victory points. So with all those in mind, again, the objective of the game is to try to score the most victory points. Okay, so step 2 in teaching the game is to talk about, in a little more detail, each of the components of the game. So in this case, again, we're teaching the game London, And I'm going to start by talking about the board. So I'm going to say to people, hey, let's have a closer look at the board. The board is really divided into two parts. On the top of the board, you have a depiction of the City of London. And the City of London is divided into boroughs, which are divided by the lines you see on the board. You'll also see that several of the boroughs are separated by the Thames River that's running through the center of the board. Each of these boroughs represents an opportunity to build using your building tokens into those areas, and by doing so, scoring the points as indicated by the victory point hexagon symbol. Likewise, on the board, you'll also see a symbol for money in pounds sterling and a symbol for cards. And what that means is when you're building this particular borough, you have to pay that amount in pounds sterling, and you will receive that number of cards, in this case 4. A couple other rules about building in this area are you have to start by building one of the red parts of the city, and then from there, building must move adjacent. So I've explained the board, and in a similar fashion I would explain the other components in the game. For example, I would explain the victory point tokens, the underground tokens, the building chits, and over on this side of the board I'd go through in detail the loan markers, the coins that are used for money in the game, and the poverty tokens. And as well, I would spend a little bit of time on the cards themselves by describing the anatomy of a card, how the icons on the card works, and how they interact with other parts of the game as well. So once you've gone through sequentially every component of the game, you've given the players a great overall view of how they interact with the game itself. Okay, so step 3 is to explain the flow and the structure of the game. So for the game of London, I would say to players that turns are going, this game is divided into a number of turns, and the game ends when the draw deck is exhausted. We're going to randomly choose a start player, and turns are going to move in clockwise direction around the table. On your turn, you're going to do two things. The first thing you're going to do is draw a card, either from the draw deck or from the display area. The second thing you're going to do is you're going to choose one action. And the actions you choose are from 4 possible actions. The first action is to play cards. The second action is to buy land. The third action is to run your city. And the fourth action is to draw 3 cards. That is going to end your turn. And just before you pass turn on to the next person, you need to check that your hand size is 9 cards or less. If it is, turn moves to the next player. So the next part is part 4, explaining the decisions or actions that your players have. And because you've already explained the structure of a turn and the structure of the turns in the game, you have the ability then to position the actions within that. So in the game of London, for example, you would describe how in the phase where a player draws a card, they have to make a decision between drawing one of the face-up cards that are in the display area or drawing off the draw deck. Similarly, in turn, you'd go to the 4 decisions that they need to make on their turn, whether they're buying land or running their city, and you describe in detail how each of those would work. So you really want to focus in this phase on the decisions and the decision making and the actions that need to take place. So finally, step 5 is the final step in our process, where we want to touch on the finer points in the game and any strategy tips you want to give. And at this stage, that's usually pretty minimal because players are just learning the game. It may be several games in before they really want to get into strategy. So in the game of London, I might explain some of the finer points like the conversion of money to victory points, reminding players again what's involved there. I might explain the difference between victory points on the upper part of the card and the lower part of the card. I would certainly explain elements of what happens when you run your city and how you collect poverty at the end of that, and so on. And if you're familiar with this game, you'll know what I mean. Likewise, from a strategy perspective, you'll want to touch on strategy. In a game like London, you might want to explain to people that you want to time running your city at a time when you have a small number of cards in your hand, for example. And 1 or 2 tips like that are really all you need at this stage. So that's step 5. Hey, so in this short video, you've seen the 5-step process for explaining games. And as I said earlier, this isn't the only way, but I found this way has worked quite well for me. I hope you found this valuable. We used an example of Martin Wallace's London as an example of how you might describe the game. And of course, the process is going to vary from game to game. The other tip I'll throw in is that sometimes you need to be prepared to have a practice turn or 2, or in some cases, depending on the complexity of the game, even more than that, maybe even a learning game. So those are some of the things that we should all think about when we're thinking about teaching games. And remember, our ability to teach games clearly and effectively has a big impact on the enjoyment people have, especially new people to our hobby.